on the Six Screens Telenetwork, the go-to site for your infinite source of precise, reliable, and factual material exposing the Watchtower organization.
All right, Jay, we're going to eliminate the song today. We're going to bring you right into it. I think you can hear me good. I can hear you.
Yep.
And I just want to tell you, too, that Brian, I don't know if you heard it or not, but the fellow Brian that would come in on Sundays and Saturday night, his wife died this week, evidently. Yeah.
Oh, no.
Yeah, she was a Jehovah's Witness, and he loved his wife. And so he's a really good listener to the Six Screens. But I wanted to share that with you because I know we would come in and talk to you so many times, but I'm sure he'll come back and have things to say. But we'll be praying for Brian. He's a good man. So I just wanted to bring that to your attention, Jay. So I'm here if you need me. I think you get plenty of questions, and we do have a lot of people coming in today, so maybe we can get some people to ask some questions. Thank you.
All righty. Yeah, I've got a couple, I've got several questions, and I've got a lead in that I want to put in my own comment question. And but then, yeah, we'll open up the lines for anybody who has a question. But let me tell you the questions we've got in the queue here. Besides, I want to address an issue of what would I say in my ministry to those who are non-believers, atheists, agnostics, a little presentation that I have for folks. I think it's helpful. Then I have a number of questions that several of them you passed my way, Rick, but I've got some that I found elsewhere as I went to the YouTube lists there, YouTube videos. People have been posting questions there. And someone has posted, again, a question on blood. And I look back, and over the times that we've done this question on blood, I've done it in pieces and parts. And apparently that's not the right way to do it. I need to answer it totally in all its parts. So that's what I'm going to do today. That will take a few minutes because I'm going to go over all the scriptures. So the question will be that was posed at a YouTube site is Genesis 9 verses 2 through 4. What does that mean? And does that mean that all humans are prevented or barred from ever eating meat containing blood forever? And we're going to look at that. We're going to examine the whole issue of Old Testament, New Testament, including Genesis 9. So that's going to be question number one. After I do a presentation, what would I say to atheists and agnostics? Question number two. Jehovah's Witnesses say they are Christian, but at their memorial of Christ's death, they don't partake of the emblems. Can one be a Christian and not partake? Well, I've touched on that, I think, before, but I'm going to talk about that again today. Question number three. Why do Jehovah's
Okay.
Whoops.
It's okay. That's my problem.
Okay, you know what that is. Okay.
Yep.
Why do Jehovah's Witnesses feel it is so important that Jesus died on a stake? What's that about? Another question. What is the main reason Bible scholars reject the New World Translation? Well, we're going to do that. Another one here. I'm going to lift this up in the list of Q questions. I'm moving this one up earlier now. Jehovah's Witnesses believe 607 was the fall of Jerusalem. Is their year correct, and how important is it in biblical chronology? So I had scheduled that to do that later. I want to do that, see if I can get to it today. It's a really good question. All right, now that's where I'm going to start, and I don't need to read all of these off because I really have a good long list, and it's not necessary to go any further than that. Okay, so again, I'm Jay Hess. I live in the Raleigh-Durham area of North Carolina. I have a small church in Garner, North Carolina. It's a non-denominational church. It would be in the Evangelical Baptist type community and theology. I'm an associate member of the Evangelical Theological Society and have been for, about 25 years. And that has been a great source of information. It's a group of theologians, Bible translators, and missionaries who, of all different denominations and Christian background, who are just informed, educated Christians who want to come together and share their current research projects. And that's been a great source of information for me for the past 25 years. I was a loyal, I consider myself a loyal, baptized, dedicated Jehovah's Witness, and I was in it for 23 years. And then toward the end of my career, I was invited by the research department of Bethel, New York, invited to get involved with the research department and then the writing department briefly, and then was asked to submit a series of Watchtower study articles attempting to refute the doctrine of the Trinity, because I was an anti-Trinitarian at that time. And I ended up submitting 2 articles before they shut down that invitation. I actually have correspondence from Bethel in their written letter saying, thanking me for my submission of at least my first article. And my second article was about Jesus and that he could be worshipped. And that was when they shut down the invitation. And so that's my little history there. I got out, was kicked out. Satan kicked me out of his organization back in 1991, and was very disoriented, confused. Why would this organization kick me out? I had no idea that whatever it is that whatever I had done, that it was wrong. I never had seen a Watchtower saying that it was wrong to worship Jesus. After all, the 1945 charter, it's actually a charter amendment that was filed in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, said that the purpose of the Watchtower Society, among a zillion other things, was to worship Jehovah God and Jesus Christ. So where's the problem in what I was saying? And after all, the October 1945 Watchtower says that we worship Jesus. And the books written by Rutherford in the 20s, such as Deliverance, says that we as Jehovah's Witnesses worship Jehovah and Jesus Christ. And that while Catholics worship Mary, and that's wrong, it's right that we worship Jehovah and Jesus Christ. So what's the problem? And I never got an answer other than to tell me that I had been disfellowshipped. So that's history, my history, and now you know how it works out, because I was searching and wondering and puzzled about what's truth, what is the truth. I want the truth. I love God. I've gotten into the Bible. I believe that the Bible is true. So what is going on? I couldn't figure out where I'd gone wrong, because I was holding to the Watchtower Society's teachings that were true all through the years that I could see up until 1990. Oh, that's right. In late 1990, true, or 91, the Society published in the Theocratic School outline that they put in a Kingdom Ministry sometime from the end of one year into the next. They had a statement in there: we do not worship Jesus. And until that time, the Society had never, that I've seen, had ever seen myself in the literature, a statement that we cannot worship Jesus. And I challenged, and the circuit overseer and the elders, the ones that were at the judicial committee, could not come up with a statement that Jesus is not one to be worshipped, which came out at a later time. So I struggled, continued my search, got involved with a good church in Raleigh, North Carolina, that had staff and members who were students or professors at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary out in Wake Forest. And that was nice. Got some good insight and information at the PhD level that was very encouraging. Shame that most Christians don't have that input. So that's who I am, and I'm the pastor, teacher, elder. We don't usually say pastor. My real title is found at Luke 17:10. I think it's my real title is found at Luke 17:10, which says that I'm my title is I'm a good for nothing slave. Is that right? check that. Luke 17. Oh, sorry, Luke 7. Luke 7. Yes, Luke 17:10. Sorry, Luke 17:10. I'm a good for nothing slave. That's my official title in our church, and I wear it well. So now that's who I am, and the questions I've given them. So I'm going to start off with a question I want to discuss, and then I take a pause between each question, and folks who are on the phone can do *6 and unmute yourself, and ask a question, then *6 again and mute yourself, and we'll go from there. And as I take a pause, but I'm going to start in. I want to start with my question. The question is, what do I say to someone who's not a believer and maybe a little antagonistic, atheist or agnostic? And here's how I would present it, and say that in my journey to understand God and the Bible, I've come to a place where I'm settled. I'm aware of the questions about the Bible and translation and textual issues in Hebrew and Greek. I'm familiar with all that. And yet I've reached a place of being settled and at peace that I believe in God, I believe He's the Creator, and I believe He's the God of the Bible. However, if there was evidence and I became convinced that this God of the Bible doesn't exist, I would still live by the ethics that I find in Scriptures. Now, when I say that, these tenets and ethics that I've come to believe are different in the mainstream evangelical community. There are differences, but where I've landed is where I've landed, and it's not for everybody. It's certainly not the unanimous position, because in the evangelical community, Christians vary. But where I've landed found to be a very good ethical system that I think is very practical and very good for me, my marriage, navigating life, my relationships with others. So I would continue to live according to those tenets, even if I became convinced that there was no God behind the authority of those ethics or behind any promises that I find in Scripture. But further to that, as I said, right now, I do indeed believe in the God of the Bible, that He is real, He's the Creator, and He has promises. But there is another facet other than just living with the current ethics, the ethics that I see currently in the Bible, and that is the hope. Hope matters a lot. Hope enables us to cope with the daily troubles and the way the world is going, with life and death of our lost relatives. Hope is great. And if someone says, that's a fantasy, you're living in a fantasy world, you want to live in the real world, I said, all right, I got an illustration, and you just tell me what you think. Here's my illustration. Let's pick out 3 pediatric wards in the nearby cities. Children that are been diagnosed terminal, within a year they will be dead, likelihood, and there's no hope. No real hope. There is maybe some amazing hope if some amazing discovery is made in science. They might be rescued, but as far as living a full, normal life, no, there is no hope because of these terrible childhood diseases, maybe genetic diseases. Let's take three pediatric wards, different hospitals. We'll go to one, and we'll say, let's just give them the real thing, the real facts. No vain hopes, none. So we go, say to all these kids, you're dying, you know it, there's no hope, deal with it. The next group, we're going to go and give them that reality, but we're going to, the first group, we allow them to, eat happy meals, and we give them TV and let them go into make-believe worlds, cartoons, well, we'll do that too, of course. But we're going to tell them right up front the real thing. There's no hope. Second group, we go over them, similar, but we do a little bit stretching of our hope, and we want to pass that on to them. It's not based in science, but we say, there's a chance. There's a chance that medical science is going to come through with a breakthrough, and most of you will get to go home, you'll be well, you'll live a long life, and everything will be fine. But the doctor is saying this thinking, no, that's not exactly the truth. But let's do that to give them some hope, lift their spirits. Now the third group, different. We go with them and I say, all right, and with the approval of the hospital, of course, I said, I got a book in my hand here. It's called the Bible. And there are about 1 billion people on the planet, and certainly if you go over the last couple hundred years, over 1 billion people have trusted in this book as being true. And it has answers, certainly answers on ethics and navigating life and relationships and having good, healthy relationships with others. But it offers something else. It gives an explanation for how we got here. There's an explanation for who started life on planet Earth. And it explains how life based on DNA and cell membranes came about, that it didn't come about by random accident, but came about by a design. Same as if a scientist got in a lab and with all his tools and experiments and test tubes created life. Of course, scientists can't do that yet. But if they could, that would be intelligent design. Well, this book that I'm holding right here claims that there is a designer and he's intelligent, and he started DNA-based life that uses cell membranes to protect that DNA machinery, protect it from the environment. And this book goes on to do other things. It says, it makes a claim that about 2,000 years ago, there was a guy by the name of Jesus, we say Jesus, came and he preached for a short period of time, and it was in a community where of Jews, where the Jews were, although upset with Rome, they were pretty much comfortable with their life and hopeful in their God. And this fellow, and this was within Rome, which was a very powerful empire that was known for building roads to connect one side of their empire with another. And this fellow Jesus, in that community, that world situation, was first, of course, encountered Judaism and held to the God of the Jews, but he was confronted with the gods of Rome and Greece. And there was a god by the name of Mithras that was a prominent deity in Rome. And this Jesus, according to Christian records and references outside of the Bible that this Jesus existed, he was put on trial by Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, put to death, and according to those who were later on arrested and interviewed, said that this Jesus was resurrected and he is king. And they were willing to die for this belief. And then, over a period of about 2 centuries, the believers of this, followers of this Jesus, they came out of Judaism, left everything that they had known, all their comforts, not for money, not for power, not for glory. And then Gentiles started leaving their comfort zone, worshiping Mithras, having political power, money, glory, power. They walked away. And with 200 years, Mithras was gone, and Christianity dominated Rome more than any other religion. 2.5 centuries. And 1 billion people have put faith in this book, and they, the Jews studied it every week, once a week, and they had hope, and when Jesus came, offered them an expansion of that hope, that they, although this is a terrible world where there's sin and death and suffering and pain. You can live again in a perfect world with your family, with friends, and friends you don't even have yet. And there'll be no more pain or suffering. It's called the gospel of the kingdom. All right, so that presentation. Now, let's say we reinforce each of these statements made through these 3 pediatric wards. After a period of 6 months, who will have the highest spirits and the most hope and be able to cope with joy? That's the end of that presentation. It doesn't depend upon pie in the sky by and by. It depends upon a textbook that gives hope. And yeah, it's hope for the future. We don't know what the future brings. But it is faith rooted on a textbook and archaeology and history of how that text was copied. Okay, and that's my presentation, where some will say, you know, they'll say, okay, which group will have more hope and higher spirits? And if your goal is to be happy in this life, that should tell you which of these 3. I'm sure the kids that got a lot of television and superheroes and maybe some hope that doctors will rescue them had some better spirits than the kids who had nothing. But which would you choose? And with that, I mentioned that to everybody that I also have a discipleship course. It takes about 6 months to a year to go through. And the very first chapter covers what I just mentioned. It approaches the issue of the Bible as a textbook without claiming that there is actually a real God. But yet the book exists, how it was transmitted, why we have a measure of trust in its writings, how it was delivered, and why the people copied it year after year, because they had some evidence that they put their trust in, which included, as I said, Jesus. So that's something we do in our church, is that I disciple people. It's, some say, what does this Jay guy, does he ever, make disciples? Yeah, that's what I do. I am the director of discipleship in our church. I have been for 8 years in the previous church as well. And I wish to do in this show what I wish someone could have done for me years ago. Would have spared me some pain and suffering, but this pain and suffering that I've been through has equipped me to do what I'm doing today. All right, so that was my first comment on the first question. I'm going to pause here in case anybody says, I've got a comment or question about what you just said, Jay. So you star 6, and you can unmute yourself and say, hey, Jay, I got a question. If not, we'll go on to another question, which is, the next question is about blood. Right? We'll go on to that question now. Here's the question that was posed. Genesis 9, 2 through 4. Jay, you've answered these other questions about blood, but you left this part out, and this, for me, is key verse here. So I'm going to read Genesis 9, 2 through 4, shape the question, and actually going to expand on it, because I want to cover it once and for all. I don't mind talking about it again sometime, but at least I can refer people back to the April 24th edition of this call. And we're right off near the top of the time we discussed blood. So here's Genesis 9, 2 through 4. Now, most of the time I use the ESV, that's the English Standard Version. And I'm going to read 2 through 4 and then touch on it in verse 9. So here we go. This is, of course, God to Noah. The fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth and upon every bird of the heavens, upon everything that creeps on the ground and all the fish of the sea. Into your hand they are delivered. Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. And as I gave you the green plants, I give you everything. But you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood. Okay, now there could be a couple ways to take that, but either way it involves blood. One might think, oh, this only applies to animals that are still living and you try to eat them. I suppose that's possible. I don't think that's what this is saying. I think it is really talking about the blood is still in this animal. You're eating the flesh with its blood. The blood is in this animal. It has not been bled out. If it was bled out, then you could eat it. And in a bit, we're going to read some other passages that sound like it. So in fact, I'm going to go down in my notes now, and I'm going to read some of these passages elsewhere that sound very much like it. Okay, so for example, here's one, Leviticus 19:26. Now remember, what is Leviticus? It's one of the 5 books of Moses that we call the Pentateuch. Leviticus is more precisely the Levitical law for the priests to deal with, and the Levitical attendants, those from the tribe of Levi. So this is going to be kosher law with other things mixed in. Leviticus 19:26 says this: "You shall not eat any flesh with the blood in it." And that says, "You shall not interpret omens or tell fortunes." Yeah, okay, but right now there's a little phrase there: "You shall not eat any flesh with the blood in it." And yeah, I think that sounds like what we just read in Genesis 9:4. Here's another one, Deuteronomy, also part of 5 books of Moses. Deuteronomy 12:23 says, "Only be sure that you do not eat the blood, for the blood is the life, and you shall not eat the life with the flesh." Oh, that too sounds like what we had in Genesis 9:4. And the final one, 1 Samuel 14:32-34. The people pounced. This is Samuel, so this is later on, early time of the kings. "The people pounced on the spoil and took sheep and oxen and calves and slaughtered them on the ground, and the people ate them with the blood. Then they told Saul, 'Behold, the people are sinning against the Lord by eating with blood.' And he said, 'You have dealt treacherously.'" And then he goes on to say, let's set up for getting a sacrifice here. And then verse 34 says, "And Saul said, 'Disperse yourselves among the people and say to them, let every man bring his ox or his sheep and slaughter them here and eat, and do not sin against the Lord Yahweh by eating with the blood.'" There it is, eating with the blood. "So every one of the people brought his ox with him that night, and they slaughtered them there." So this was a time of performing a sacrifice to compensate for their sin of what? Eating the flesh with the blood in it. So all of these passages read that same way. And what I wanted to focus on now is that verse 9 in Genesis 9. Genesis 9:2-4. Verse 9 says, "Behold, I establish my covenant with you and your offspring after you." That's a hint of who this law applied to about eating the flesh with its life. Those in the covenant. He says, "I establish my covenant with you and your offspring after you." So, there in Genesis 9, who does this apply to? Well, to Noah and his children, offspring after him. But if they are not taught that and do not come into that covenant, they won't know. But this would say that if they know that covenant, God has made that covenant with them, and they're in it, they claim to be in it, then they're held accountable. But I read it. What is the accounting? What are the consequences if they do eat flesh with its life? Do you remember in any of these passages that we read, Leviticus, it just says don't do it. The one in Deuteronomy says don't do it. And 1 Samuel is the only one that gives a hint as to what the consequences are. He mentions a sacrifice. Now, the Watchtower taught us differently. The Watchtower said this is a death penalty law. Oh, yeah, that's right. Isn't there a scripture somewhere that says that? And all of us who are well into the Watchtower, we know, okay, it's Luke 17, so we're going to look at that. But I'm going to go back and pick out the real relevant verses, and there's a surprise here, because if we're thinking, oh, Watchtower taught that everyone who eats blood is put to death, there's a surprise here. Let's check it out. So I'm going to go to Leviticus 11, 17. Again, Levitical application here to the priests and Levites. Leviticus 11, 39 through 40. Let's see what the consequences are for eating. Here it is. And if any animal which you may eat dies, whoever touches its carcass shall be unclean until the evening. Okay, so that's touching. Keep going. Verse 40, and whoever eats of its carcass, this sounds like the same situation, eating the flesh with its blood, because it talks about an animal that just dies. Where's the blood? It's in the animal. So you're eating the flesh with the blood. So what does it say, rest of verse 40? Whoever eats of its carcass shall wash his clothes and be unclean until the evening. That's the consequence. Then it says, and whoever carries the carcass shall wash his clothes and be unclean till the evening. No death penalty there. And if you're wondering why the evening, the answer is that the evening was the mark, the demarcation between the previous day and the following day. So this is saying, if you touch a dead thing, you have to wait. How long? Well, until the next day, which doesn't begin at midnight, but begins in the evening at sundown. I don't remember the Watchtower making that point, about eating blood, and you just have to wash your clothes. That's it. Of course, we did read 1 Samuel, and there it was make a sacrifice. Yeah. All right, let's keep going. That was Leviticus 11. Let's go to Leviticus 17, 15. And every person who eats what dies of itself, sounds like Genesis, doesn't it? And the one before, Leviticus 11, says, and every person who eats what dies of itself, or what is torn by beasts, whether he is a native or a sojourner. Oh, what's that? What's a native or a sojourner? In Hebrew, there are different words for different classifications of people. There's the people that live there that are native born and part of the clan. Then there's the sojourner. That's the person who is an outsider but has gotten permission to live there. Maybe in the cities. Or maybe he has a permanent residence on someone else's land as a servant. So that's native or sojourner. Let's keep reading the verse. It says, these two shall wash his clothes and bathe himself in water, and be unclean until the evening. Then he shall be clean. So this verse adds a little bit more. Well, it's implied that if he'll be unclean until evening, that implies that afterwards he'll be clean. Verse 16. This sounds ominous, this one. But if he does not wash them or bathe his flesh, he shall bear his iniquity. Oh. So there are further consequences if he does not wash or bathe. I don't remember the Watchtower making that clear. So the first consequence is you just wash and you're all good. So even if you eat, okay, remember that in verse 15, eat. So the word eat is there. And this was true of a native who lived there, of course, or a sojourner who may not be under the law of Moses, but he lives there like a permanent resident. And he's held to a standard. What standard? that if he eats it, he's got to wash before the day is out. And if he doesn't wash, there is a problem with that. It doesn't say what, but I can believe that that might be the death penalty because it's more serious than just washing. And there's reason for saying that. Now, I'm about to get to the big surprise. Now, in Leviticus 17, we learned that the native or the sojourner, so the Jew or those who have like permanent residency, you know, they've got to wash. Okay, they've got to wash. But a Jew would probably not mess with it, or if he did touch blood, he'd wash real quick. Now, here is something else. Now, something I need to add here. Deuteronomy, of course, is not Levitical law. This is more the common law, and this was written long after. Remember, how long did the Israelites wander in the desert? Yeah, day for year. 40 years. Day for a year. A year for a day, from the day of spying out the land. So they're in their 40 years. So at the end of that journey is when Deuteronomy gets written. So there are sometimes some adjustments to things that the Levitical law was still considered true, but it starts earlier in their travels in the desert. And unless those laws get adjusted, and some did, you hold to them as stated in Leviticus. Let's see what Deuteronomy has to say. Deuteronomy 14, 19 through 21. Here's a surprise. And all winged insects are unclean for you. They shall not be eaten. Now this you would be referring to the Jews. As Moses is handing the laws to those who are entering or have entered into the covenant of Moses. Verse 20. All clean winged things you may eat. You shall not eat anything that has died naturally. Oh, we've heard that one before. This is like we saw in Genesis 9. Dies naturally, it's got blood in it. So he says, you shall not eat anything that has died naturally. Next verse, next sentence, look at this. You may give it to the sojourner who is within your towns, that he may eat it. Or you may sell it to a foreigner, for you are a people holy to the Lord, Yahweh your God. Well, there's a surprise. God is saying, now that you've entered into the covenant, you better not eat things that have died of their own, that have got blood in them. That's off the table. Joke there. But then he says, however, if you've got this dead animal and you wonder what to do with it, you could go into business selling it to others. The sojourners, see, there were sojourners that left with the Israelites when they left out of Egypt, that were traveling with the Jews as they went through the wilderness. And under those conditions, if you touch something bloody, blood in it, you really shouldn't eat it, but you need to wash up if you touch it. That was the Levitical law. Don't eat it. And if somehow you do ingest it or you touch it, you need to wash before the day is out. And if you don't wash, there's going to be trouble. Now, Deuteronomy, which is years later, an adjustment, now things have changed. The Jews still strictly cannot eat this stuff. But if you've got it, you can sell it. You can give it away, or you could sell it to that sojourner that is with you, who's now within your towns. Before that, you didn't have towns when Leviticus was first written. Now we're in Deuteronomy. You've got towns. You can sell it to them. The law has changed a little bit, hasn't it? And some can eat it without a problem. And then we read that one in 1 Samuel, that where the Jews, was an actual example where they ate with the blood. Was there a death penalty? No, not a bit. But they had to atone for their deliberate sin. And one way is to wash, and here Saul is having them do a sin offering to God. That is an interesting thing that we just learned. Well, what did we learn? And here's, I'm going to give you the answer now that we've gone through these scriptures. Here's the answer. Under the law of Moses, there is a kosher, what we call the kosher law, dietary. You call it dietary, and it is. It's dietary. It has to do with what you eat. It's the holiness law, the purity law. And under that holiness, purity law, there are two kosher categories for blood, two regulatory categories for blood. The first one we just read, which is that blood, if it's come out of the body or it's sat in the body, it's not a living thing, it's not in a living animal. The blood is fine in that living animal. But if the animal is dead, torn apart by animals, or you've killed it and the animal is just sitting there, that blood is unclean. Okay? And it's unclean, and you can't eat it. Okay? And so we read those verses. All right? That's category number one. It's unclean, and they can't, that day, that right away, before the sun goes down, before that day is done, within 24 hours, or the evening, they have to wash. And if they don't, well, there's a problem. Now, this is not the only example of such where blood clean. There is Leviticus 19, which is the law of all the discharges, bodily fluid discharges. And they're all listed as being unclean. Now, Leviticus 15, 19 through 30, talks about a woman's cycle, adult woman's cycle, that blood is unclean. And I'm going to emphasize this, that the scriptures say this blood from the adult woman in her cycle or from a dead animal is unclean. The reason I mention that is that the Watchtower has vacillated on this issue of is blood clean or unclean. I remember reading that article myself, that up till that point, the Watchtower had emphasized how unclean blood was, and you don't want to transfuse it. Certainly you don't want to eat it. It's unclean. Then they changed their wording and said, well, it's not because it's unclean. It's actually because blood is holy. This is where the Watchtower got confused. They weren't able to put these verses together, because here in Leviticus 15, we clearly have verses that say this blood is unclean. There's nothing that says this is holy. No. Okay? So they missed that. I mean, they thought they had it right, but they missed that. And I'll talk about it in just a minute, in a moment, just why they came with the idea that it's holy. All right. So again, category number one that we're talking about is that blood, right after something is dead, or even if the blood is poured out, or adult woman's cycle, this blood is right from the start unclean. Oh, but there's a whole nother category under the law. Blood can also be sacred. And that is in those cases where the blood is in an animal that's about to be sacrificed. Now, normally after an animal is killed, that blood is immediately unclean. Not so here. If an animal is dedicated to be a sacrifice, that blood is not unclean. It's considered absolutely sacred blood. And it can transfer its holiness to anything that touches it. So this is just the opposite. This is the opposite of what touching unclean blood does. This blood, you touch it, you're holy. And it's used to make things holy, whether it be the sacrificial altar or people or priests or whatever. Instead of when they put this blood on a priest on his earlobe and his thumb and his toe, make him unclean. It made him holy. And the Watchtower never put that together. First they emphasized uncleanness, then they switched to it's holy, and they couldn't get that straightened out. And the point is that there are two, count them, two kosher categories or regulatory categories for blood, unclean and clean. Now some verses such as Leviticus 14:14, this is where the blood is in and put on the earlobe or the thumb or toe of the priest. So Leviticus 14:14, Leviticus 14:25, and so on. Then Leviticus 16:19 is a much bigger sprinkling of the blood. They sprinkle the blood from the sacrifice on the people and cleanses them from their uncleanness. It doesn't make them unclean. It cleanses them from their uncleanness. So, putting this together, if you were to touch a dead animal, or a Jew were to touch a dead animal and it's got blood in it, or touch the blood, or eat it, he would be immediately be made unclean. What would clean him up? Well, according to Leviticus 16:19, sprinkling of the blood of a sacrifice would clean him from having touched blood. So now sprinkling blood on him cleans him from the blood he touched. And this was the point of 1 Samuel that we read, where Saul says, okay, we got a sacrifice. Now you know why. You can offer up a sacrifice, and that blood off of the altar will cleanse the people from the blood, the unclean blood that they touched or ate, which we saw, like I said, in the 1 Samuel passage 14. Interesting. So this kind of ties it together, that of any the blood and why the Watchtower kind of, it makes it kind of confusing. There are two categories, the unclean and the unclean. And if you get unclean blood on you, you can fix that either by washing or a sin offering, where the blood of the sacrifice will cleanse you from the unclean blood you touched. And a little sub-point here is that much of this is in Leviticus, because Leviticus is the Levitical law. And in Leviticus, blood is mentioned 65 times. And 10 of those times has to do with just simply the unclean category of blood. The other 55 times are all about the sacred blood that's connected to an animal sacrifice. One last thing. What about fat? This is funny. Watchtower really doesn't want to talk about that. Okay, according to the Bible, the same laws in the first 5 books of Moses, fat has 3 categories, very similar to blood, but there's 3. One of them is the sacred or holy kind of blood. And we're going to read some of those. There's Exodus 29:13, which says, and you shall take all the fat that covers the entrails and the long lobe of the liver and the 2 kidneys with the fat that is on them and burn them on the altar. So this is one of the categories of fat. It's sacred fat because it's part of the animal sacrifice. Okay, another one, Leviticus 3 and Leviticus chapter 4 and chapter 7 and 17. I'm just going to read them. Leviticus 3:3 was similar to the other about taking the fat and putting it on the altar. It is a food offering. In fact, it says that from the sacrifice of the peace offering as a food offering to the Lord Yahweh, he shall offer the fat. It's part of the peace offering, a food offering to God, Leviticus 3:3. Leviticus 3:16 through 17, and the priest shall burn them on the altar as a food offering with a pleasing aroma. All fat is the Lord's. It shall be a statute forever throughout all your generations. In all your dwellings, that you eat neither fat nor blood. Oh, look at that. Eat neither fat nor blood. What's going on here? This is, again, of course, the sacred blood, which, can you eat it? No, there's a death penalty. Why is there a death penalty for eating sacred blood? Because it belongs to God, and you're taking it from God. This blood has life in it. It has the power of life. And who is the source of life? God. So who can eat of the sacred blood that has life in it? Nobody can eat, no Jew. It goes to God. Same is true for the fat, the sacred fat. That is burned up. It goes to God. And if anybody tries to eat that fat, and it's the fat that's supposed to go to God, that's bad. Leviticus 4:35 says this, and all its fat he shall remove, as the fat of the lamb is removed from the sacrifice of peace offerings, and the priest shall burn it on the altar, on top of the Lord's food offerings, and the priest shall make atonement for him of the sin in which he's committed, and he shall be given. So this fat, see, it didn't mention blood, it mentioned fat. The fat has the power to cleanse and forgive sins. Okay? Now, what about someone, now that's, but by burning it on the altar and the smoke going up to God, this is a wonderful aroma to God. But what if someone eats it? Leviticus 7:25 answers this. For every person who eats of the fat of an animal, which a food offering may be made to the Lord Yahweh, shall be cut off from his people. Now, some have wondered what is cut off. Watchtower does say it means put to death, and I agree with that. Someone believes it means something else. Okay, we can examine it, but I do believe it's a death penalty. So this is true, that you eat the blood that's of a sacrifice or eat the fat of a sacrifice. That is a death penalty. Leviticus 17:6. Leviticus 17, you remember that's our favorite passage, chapter that Watchtower drilled into us. And the priest shall throw the blood on the altar of Yahweh, the Lord Yahweh, at the entrance of the tent of meeting, and burn the fat for a pleasing aroma to the Lord Yahweh. Interesting, again, this is Leviticus, and you notice it doesn't mention tabernacle or temple, it mentions tent. Why do I point that out? Is because Leviticus was written and applied to the people as they traveled through the desert. This is not for when they landed into the promised land. And Deuteronomy refines, adjusts some of these laws. Let's see, another one we want to read here. This is Leviticus 7:24. This is a second category of fat, which is marginally unclean, kind of, sort of, and it should not be eaten, but you could use it for something else. So this is Leviticus 7:24. The fat of an animal that dies of itself. Fat of an animal that dies of itself. We've heard that before. Now the blood, absolutely, that would make you unclean. You'd have to go wash. Or maybe a sin offering and have the pure blood touch you, and then you are clean of eating the blood. This one says the fat of an animal dies of itself. The fat of one that is torn by beasts may be put to any other use. So you can use it. I don't know what you might use it for, but it says, but on no account shall you eat it. So there's the prohibition. You can't eat it. Does it say what the punishment is? No. Not here. And I'm going to make the claim that it doesn't say it because it doesn't need to be said. It's just that it's clean fat in the sense that it has not sat too long. Blood, on the other hand, sits in a dead animal or sits out. That God says, no, 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 you can't eat of that. You are unclean. This just says, don't eat it. I assume that likewise, though, you might be unclean. But you could use that fat for something else and not be marked unclean. So this is kind of a gray area. It's fat that still is tainted because it's an animal that died of itself. It's not a death penalty.
It was probably used for lamp oil or candles or to tan hides of other animals.
Ah, thank you. All right, now that's on the recording. There's another use for fat. I didn't grow up on a farm. I don't know much about farming, so thank you for that. So that's our second category, and you don't want to eat it, but if you did, it's probably like the other laws. Now, if it's been offered on an altar, you're dead. Dead meat. You are dead if you eat this fat or eat the blood. You're dead if it's off of the altar. But I said there's a third category. Here's the third category. Nehemiah 8. Nehemiah 8, 9 through 11 says, and Nehemiah, who was the governor, and Ezra the priest and scribe, and the Levites who taught the people, said to all the people, okay, here's what everybody's teaching. The Levites are teaching. Here it is. This day is holy to Yahweh your God. Do not mourn or weep. For all the people wept as they heard the words of the law. So they're hearing these words of the law, the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses, and all the kosher laws. This is what they're hearing, and this is what the teachers are saying. He said to them, go your way, eat the fat. That's what it says. Eat the fat and drink sweet wine, and send portions to anyone who has nothing ready, for this day is holy to our Lord. And do not be grieved, for the joy of Yahweh is your strength. So the Levites calmed all the people, saying, be quiet, for this day is holy. Do not be grieved. So, as they're reading the kosher law, what do the Levites tell them today? Party, banquet, eat the tasty fat and the wine. Now, this should make it clear. Some of these laws are death penalty laws to eat the fat, and some of them are banquet rules. And my point is this, the Watchtower never put this together. They got it confused, and because of that, they took the hard stance, and they said, if you eat blood, any kind of blood, anything at all, that's a severe, like a death penalty. They quote the passage that says that you will die, you should be put to death, cut off from the people, and I agree that would be death. But they don't explain it. That the blood that they might eat, and I get it, it's unclean, and the fat that they might, that might be unclean. The punishment was not death. Either you washed up that day before the day ended, or you might have to, if let's say it went over a day, I assume that then you have to go get to the priest and say, I've touched this blood of a dead animal and I'm unclean. What can you do for me? And the priest would say, all right, we'll do an animal sacrifice here and take the blood of the sacrifice. That will atone for the blood you touched. Here, let me sprinkle this sacrificial blood on you, and you're all clean now. Watchtower never explained that. Why not? Because this whole thing would collapse. Now, I'm going to make a comment. I did mention that passage in Deuteronomy 14, right, where a Jew who couldn't eat the blood could go into business selling it to others. Now, does that ring a bell? Because the Watchtower had an article on it, but I was in this 30 years ago, so it was before that, so it would have been 35 years ago. And I remember that article because we always thought blood was unclean and there was no compromise and you couldn't use it. Then there was a Watchtower article, maybe it was a question from you, I don't remember now, where they said, they mentioned this verse, that's how I remembered it, because the Watchtower brought it out. They quoted this verse and said, does this mean that since you can go into business selling it to others, that you could, as a doctor, give a blood transfusion? to a non-witness. And I'm trying to remember what their final conclusion was, and I'd have to go back and check the article. It's not all that important. But I remember the Watchtower wrestled with this verse, because it seems to imply that those outside of the covenant are different and could be treated differently. Well, the verse says so, and so the Watchtower tried to bring that up to date. But here's the key. Why am I hammering on this Deuteronomy 14:21, that you can give it to a non-believer? Because if Genesis 9, remember that's the first verse we talked about, if Genesis 9 means that all humans descendant from Noah, which is everybody today, is under obligation, they cannot eat blood, what does this verse mean? Deuteronomy 14, that you could go into business selling it to these other Gentiles. This contradicts the Genesis 9 conclusion that that was for all time, all people. So that was the original question that I got that was posted on YouTube. Doesn't Genesis 9 apply to all people for all time? And the answer is no. The answer is found in Deuteronomy 14 when they enter the promised land. Actually, no, because you can sell it to these Gentiles. Why? Because they're not in the covenant. Yes, they're descendants from Noah, but they have not preserved being in the covenant and recognizing that. So, God says, now that there's a better covenant, which is the covenant of Moses, that is in effect, this is what y'all need to be signing up for. And if you're a descendant of Noah, and you know about this covenant, well, there's version 2 now, and you need to sign up for that. Oh, by the way, if you join the covenant, you still can't eat blood from dead stuff. But if you don't join the covenant, you can. In fact, the Jews can sell you some. And the point of this is that you can, the Watchtower can guide us to read into things that aren't there. Read into the Genesis 9 account that this was for all people for all time, which isn't true. Or that the punishment is the death penalty, which isn't true. But because the Watchtower hid it, they knew this verse in Deuteronomy 14, but did they stop and say, oh, by the way, that kind of contradicts what we thought Genesis 9 meant, so we'll just scratch that. We're not going to use Genesis 9 anymore. They didn't do that. Okay, I know that was long, but I wanted it to be kind of the real answer. Well, that's only Old Testament, so I'm not actually done yet. We're going to move on to the New Testament. What about the New Testament? Because we know Acts 15. Now, I've talked about this before on a number of occasions, so I got to tie this in properly, though. According to the New Testament, if you read Hebrews 7:11 through 12, it says, because we have a new high priest, this requires a change of the law. So you get a new priest, you got a new covenant, and what used to be unclean might now be clean. How will we know? Answer, you ask the high priest himself, and he will tell you. Okay, and that was Hebrews 7:11 through 12, which actually states that because we have a new priest on the order of Melchizedek, this necessitates a change of the law. And the other passage I want to go to is Hebrews 9:8 through 12, where the writer of Hebrews is going through this about the purpose of sacrifice and the difference between the old covenant and the new. The old covenant, he says at Hebrews 9:10, this only deals with food and drink and various washings, regulations for the body, imposed until the time of Reformation. That's verse 10. So what does the writer of Hebrews say? In chapter 7, he said that with a new high priest, you get a new law. And now, in Hebrews 9, a couple chapters later, verse 10, he says that all this stuff was a regulation imposed until the time of Reformation. So there's another time limit here. So those laws about blood being unclean and you need to wash. There could be a change here, and I'm going to read that verse in just a moment, that there is a change. But he implies that there is a change because all of that was strictly Old Testament law. And things were unclean, but now with a new high priest, this is changed. And I'm going to show you the verse that actually says that. In Mark 7, chapter 7, verses 14 through 20. Heed the words of our high priest. Mark 7, 14 through 20. And he called the people to him again and said to them, hear me, all of you, and understand. There is nothing outside a person. There is nothing outside a person that by going into him how? Through his mouth? What about through a syringe? Again, there is nothing outside a person that by going into him can defile him. Now, defile means it might make you sick, but as far as your relationship with God, it cannot affect. Verse 17, and when he had entered the house and left the people, his disciples asked him about the parable. And he said to them, then are you also without understanding? Sounds like somebody I would want to say that to today. Do you not see that whatever goes into a person from outside cannot defile him? The high priest just said it twice. Since it enters not his heart, but his stomach, and is expelled. Now I'm reading this right out of the translation. Thus he declared all foods clean. How many foods? All foods. Now what does clean mean? It doesn't mean healthy, but it means it will not defile your relationship with God. So if you eat blood, drink blood, or inject blood, it might not be a healthy choice, and I grant you, there's some amount of fat that I wouldn't eat that's not healthy. Too much sugar is not good for you either. But it doesn't defile your relationship with God. Verse 19 says, thus he declared all foods clean. And all foods, you know, if Jesus had an exception, this would have been a place to put it. Then he said, verse 20, and what comes out of a person is what defiles him. Mark, I'm sorry, that was Mark. That was Mark.
Again, please, sir.
Yes.
The scripture you just read was what, please?
Mark 7, 14 through 20.
Thank you.
Yes. Thank you. Now that's the more complete account is the Mark 7, but there's a short parallel in Matthew 15:11 where the principle is the same. It says, it is not what goes into the mouth that defiles a person, but what comes out of the mouth that defiles a person. But you get the same principle there in Matthew 15:11. What goes in, what you eat, does not defile. Like I say, you might, to a child, you might say, don't eat that, it'll spoil your dinner. I get that. It may not be the healthiest choice, but the word defile has to do with your relationship with God. If, and Watchtower said, if the doctor says don't drink alcohol, can you shoot it in your veins? Well, it may not be a healthy choice, but that's not what we're asking. Does it defile your relationship with God? And according to Mark 7 and Matthew 15, it does not. And yet the Watchtower ignores this and uses this to punish people who've gotten some very awkward health situations and issues, and to rip families and people apart. Can someone tell me how this is faithful and discreet? And the channel that God is using, because I am not seeing it. All right. I'm not done. If there was an exception that eating blood was wrong, our high priest would have warned us. So I'm going to read a passage here, and let's see if there's any indication that our high priest says that eating blood is wrong. Now remember, if it's wrong, what's the worst? that can happen. You need to wash within that day, or if not, you've got to get spiritually cleansed. And how? Well, we saw earlier that it could be through blood that had the power to cleanse. Okay, who's got the power to cleanse? You know, the Jews and their sacrificial system, that went out of business a long time ago. But we've got Jesus, and his blood can cleanse. So you go to Jesus, and that should cover over any uncleanness if you eat something unclean. But I'm claiming that Mark 7, our high priest says that is not going to defile you with God. Again, might not be a healthy choice, but it will not defile you. I'm going to John chapter 6, 53 through 56. Here's the irony. This passage is in the back of the reasoning, the Brown Reasoning book. Remember the Brown Reasoning book? There is a section in the back, in the appendix, that says Scriptures most often misunderstood. And this is one listed there. And they themselves are the ones who are among those who misunderstood this passage, because they have given two very different explanations for this passage. Funny. And yet they testify against themselves in the back of, I don't know if it was both editions of the Reasoning book, but one of them said verses often misunderstood. And this is there. John 6, 53 through 56. Here we go. So Jesus said to them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you." Whoa. Now, to a Jew, this is really disturbing, because sacred blood cannot be eaten. Can sacred meat be eaten? Oh, yeah, because remember, the sacrifice is brought to the priest sacrificed the animal, they cut the animal up. Some of it goes to the person who brought the animal, some of it goes to the priest, because this was a sharing of life. But the blood and the fat gets offered up to God. Why? Because it belongs to God, because the power of life goes back to God. Likes the odor of the meat, the fat where all the flavor is, and the blood goes back to God. Why do you think God made that a law if he knew that this is what Jesus should say at John chapter 6? Think about it. Let's keep reading. John 6, verse 54. "Whoever feeds on my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise him up on the last day. For my flesh is true food, and my blood is true drink. Whoever feeds on my flesh and drinks my blood abides in me, and I in him." Now, if, under the Christian system, eating blood was a heretical, terrible thing to do, why did Jesus use that here? If it's a terrible thing to do, why doesn't Jesus clarify this? That on other circumstances, you can't do this. But he leaves it alone and just says, you've got to do this. And my guess is, here's why. Jesus routinely does things that separate Jews who are satisfied in their position and are not looking for the Christ. And when Christ walks up, he says, if you want life, you got to drink my blood and eat my flesh. This is true life, true blood. It's good. What this did, and if you remember from reading the rest of this passage, this caused people to walk away. And reading on, verse 6, many of his disciples heard it. They said, "This is a hard saying. Who can listen to it?" Who? Many of his disciples said this. Not just the Pharisees, but the disciples said this. So, or many of them, but not all. Verse 61, but Jesus, knowing in himself that the disciples were grumbling about this, said to them, isn't that what the Watchtower does? They grumble at this. He says, do you take offense at this? Then what if you were to see the Son of Man ascending to where he was before? And then, you see, if Jesus said this, and this is heresy, Jesus is going to go nowhere. He's not going to be able to work any miracles because he's blaspheming against God. But the fact that they're going to see Jesus, some will see Jesus ascend, proves what? This is not blasphemy, Jesus says here. He says, so what if you see the Son of Man ascending? Verse 63, it is the Spirit who gives life, and the flesh is no help at all. The words that I have spoken to you are spirit and life, but there are some who do not believe. I'm going to keep going. Verse 66, and after this, many of his disciples, who? Many of his disciples turned back and no longer walked with him. So Jesus said to the 12, do you want to go away as well? Simon Peter answered him, Lord, to whom shall we go? Now, did Peter say, where shall we go? We need to go to an organization. What organization? That's not what Peter said. To whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life, and we have believed and have come to know that you are the Holy One of God. Jesus answered them, did I not choose you, the 12, and yet one of you is a devil? Now, my point of reasoning this is that this divided out people. Jesus says these kind of things because they divide people. Are they stuck on the old law and misunderstanding it? Or do they stop and say, wow, this guy is saying things that I not considered before? And that's the case, because as I said in Mark 7, Jesus has already pronounced these things as being clean, kosher, clean. And therefore, it is okay to eat it. The Pharisees who have not been following this did not hear Mark 7, so they don't know this. Walk away. But those who had stuck with Jesus said, oh, this makes sense. Jesus would say this. So in some way, his blood is true drink. Now, the Watchtower originally had the view that this originally referred, of course, as most people think, as would think, this referred to the communion, the Lord's Supper. But then they noticed that it said, everyone who wants life. Verse 56, whoever feeds on my flesh and drinks my blood, and I in him, and I lived, and so on. That those who want life are to take this. And Watchtower got stuck. And after publishing the reasoning book, which gave one answer, then they now have another answer, they published that this has been misunderstood. And yeah, the Watchtower misunderstood, because now they say that this applies indirectly even to the great crowd. But they knew that the great crowd, if they read that explanation, they're going to feel that they can go and partake at the Lord's Supper, which the Watchtower didn't want them to do. So they had to wiggle and hop through hoops, trying to give a new understanding. But hopefully the great crowd won't get out of it that they could drink the wine and the bread at the communion. And the Watchtower's words are true. This has been misunderstood, and they are included in the ones who have misunderstood it. Okay, a little fun there, but true. So what's the point? Is that this is true drink, and all those who are Christians who want to have their sins forgiven, because that's what the new covenant is about. Just read Jeremiah 31, where sins are forgiven, and then Hebrews chapter 8, which says, for sins forgiven, you want to be in the new covenant. You want to be in the new covenant? Is the way it's sealed. You drink, figuratively, the blood of Christ. And what I think is so amazing is that God denied this to the Jews, that here was the sacrifice that brought life, but the Jews, not even the priests, could drink the blood from the sacrifice. And I could just see God saying, just wait, because there's a sacrifice that's coming down the line that is beyond anything you would have imagined. And you can drink of the blood of this sacrifice, and it will give you eternal life. And the Jews had been watching that blood smoke for how many hundreds of years? Jesus comes on the scene and announced by John the Baptist as the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. And they have longed, oh, will we ever be able to drink of that blood? And they hang out with Jesus, and he says, this will not make you defiled. And then a little bit later, he says, my blood is true drink. And then a little bit later, last night of his life, he says, this is the blood, my blood of the covenant. That's Matthew 26, 27 through 28. I'm not done there. Got one more verse. Watchtower said, but wait a minute. Acts 15 reaffirms not the business about fat, but reaffirms about we can't eat, drink, or touch blood. Well, they misunderstand that, as you may recall, as I've touched on this before. That, bring up the verses here. In Acts 15, that if you read that carefully, and you find out that this is a, we'll say, decree. I know the Watchtower points out that word. It says a decree in the Old Translation. But you read it from the context, Acts 15:20, but then you get to verse 21. It says, and from ancient generations, Moses has had in every city those who proclaim him, for he's read in every Sabbath, in the synagogues. And then it keeps going, and then it gets down to that, oh, this decree or whatever is to be taken to whom? Not to the Jews, but to those Gentiles, the cities where Gentiles interact with Jews. So in verse 23, it says, it says, with the following letter, the brothers, both the apostles and the elders, to the brothers, what brothers? Who are of the Gentiles in Antioch, in Syria, and Cilicia, greetings. So it's to them, it's to the Gentiles, and it tells them these things to avoid. And the Watchtower makes a big deal out of it, but they misunderstand. Okay, it says, one, sacrifice to idols. Don't avoid, it doesn't say avoid sacrificing to idols. Everybody knew that. But you read the verse carefully, verse 29, that you abstain from what has been sacrificed to idols. You know, under the Old Testament, there was no law about touching those things. But things sacrificed to God, you could eat part of the meat, but not the blood. But the Jews of Jesus' day wouldn't even want to mess with the meat that was sacrificed to idols. Well, in those cities where Gentiles and Jews mix, this letter is to go out to the Gentiles and said, would you please abstain from the meat that was sacrificed to the idols? Because our Jewish Christians got a real problem with that. Then it goes on, next item is from blood. Okay, what does that mean to abstain from blood? Well, we kind of already talked about it today. If an animal drops over dead, that blood, you touch it, it's unclean. Is it a death penalty? No. You want to wash your hands afterward. Or from a woman's cycle, that's unclean. Okay, there's some washing that needs to go on there. Okay, so how do you abstain from these things? By washing. This is from things strangled. Okay, under the Old Testament law, Could you eat a strangled animal? Well, if a Jew did, what would he have to do? Before the day is done, he has to wash. If he doesn't make that out, it isn't clear, but from 1 Samuel, my guess is that you'd have to go to a priest and have an animal sacrifice and blood sprinkled on you to cleanse you from the blood of that strangled animal. So that is what the letter was, and it was given to who? Paul. Okay? It was given to Paul. And that's in verse 25. It says, it has been seemed good to us, send them to you with our beloved Barnabas and Paul. So Paul goes out with this message. Where does he go? If you follow Acts carefully and the history of Paul's travels, you know that he, after a time, went to Corinth. And then he wrote to them the letter of 1 Corinthians. I wonder if we can find anything in 1 Corinthians to deal with this very issue. And the answer is yes. You can go to 1 Corinthians chapters 5 through 11, address all of these things. Now, one thing I didn't mention in that list, the other thing was sexual immorality. I've answered that elsewhere. This is porneia. And under the Old Testament law, this was not, I gave it away already. Under the law, what was the penalty for porneia under the Old Testament law? Immorality. Not adultery. There's a different word for that. What was the Old Testament punishment? Well, you may remember when Solomon showed his wisdom, he had 2 prostitutes brought in with 1 baby, or they came in before him wanting justice. What did he do to the prostitutes, having been prostitutes? Nothing. He just determined who the real mother was and gave her child and told her to go home. Under the Old Testament, prostitution was not punished. That did not become a punishment until the New Testament when our high priest said so. Just passed over that quickly. My point was that these 4 issues listed in the letter of Acts 15 are mentioned, all of them, the kosher laws, porneia laws, all of that mentioned and discussed by Paul in 1 Corinthians chapters 5 through 11. And if you go to chapter 10, I said 11, I meant 5 through 10. Go to the end of 1 Corinthians 10, and there Paul says, eat whatever is sold, this is 10 verses 25 through 31. Eat whatever is sold in the meat market without raising any question on the ground of conscience. Okay, 1 Corinthians 10, 25. If there was any place that Paul would make that clear, if blood was off the table, that you couldn't eat it under any circumstances, this is the place where Paul would have said it, but that's not what he said. Whatever is sold in the meat market without raising any question on the ground of conscience. For the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. Then he goes on to explain that if an unbeliever, that's verse 27, if one of the unbelievers invites you, so if this is a pagan, and it's not a Jew because he wouldn't have bought this animal sacrificed to an idol, it's a pagan, and he says, oh, by the way, this is from a pagan temple. That's verse 28. This has been offered to a pagan temple. Then verse 29, he says, verse 28, 29, not because of your conscience, but because of this other guy. He's going to misunderstand your gospel message. Don't eat it. Not because it's wrong, but because it offends his conscience. And he says that, verse 31, whether you eat or drink or whatever you do all for the glory of God. That's the guiding principle here. There is not a word in 1 Corinthians 5 through 10, not a word, that says that eating blood defiles you in your relationship to God. So Watchtower misunderstood Acts 15. They purposely deceive because they say, oh, Acts 15 tells you not to be involved in idol worship. No, that's not what Paul, what was going on there. Sorry, not Paul, but Peter. That is not what's going on there in Acts 15. It's talking about the things sacrificed to an idol. Everybody knew you can't get involved in idol worship. The Watchtower subtly deceives on that. If you go back and check the Watchtower articles, they will, in their comments, they will kind of trick you on that. Shame on them. It's not about idolatry. It's about eating things sacrificed to idols. So this wraps it up. So final conclusion. Under the Old Testament law, any use of unclean blood or the eating of unclean fat was forbidden. They would need to wash and wait. This prohibition on eating unclean blood applied to all covenant members, both the Noah and the Moses covenant. Okay. As for eating sacred blood or fat, that was part of a sacrificial ritual. No one could eat either of those, the blood or the fat, upon pain of death. But for the New Testament covenant members, the sacred blood belonged to Jesus and was figuratively drank by all members, covenant members, because it gave life instead of taking it. In the Old Testament, the sacred blood took life if you ate it. Now, if you got it sprinkled on you, it would give life. But if you ate it, it took life. Under the New Testament, you can take it in this figurative form. So as for unclean blood, well, under the Old Testament, that was not allowed. But for unclean blood, it is now your choice to eat or not to eat. That is the question. And that's true for fat or blood. It is strictly a health decision or choice. It will not defile you according to the New Testament. That's not me saying this, it's the New Testament. Now, that concludes that. I know it was long, but it's because I haven't done that full presentation that I continue to get questions, and I don't mind answering it again anytime soon. I don't mind at all, but I thought, well, there ought to be one place where I give the whole thing, and you see how long that took. So, you want a pause? Anybody want to star 6? Yes, hello? I heard you.
Hey, how you doing?
Hey, I'm doing okay.
I have a question.
Yes.
You think it's okay now to eat blood?
I think it's a poor health choice. It's not something I would do, but it's a health choice. As far as defiling you for God, it's not a problem. Why? Because Jesus said so. So again, it's a health choice. If it's been handled in a certain way, maybe a doctor might convince me that there is a way. If they've, for example, drawn out my own blood and stored it, I have no fear of it. If it's blood from somebody else that have been processed and they're reasonably sure and they want to inject it, well, then it's a health choice, and the health choice is my health choice. It's nobody else's health choice. But do I think that it's forbidden by Scripture? No, it's not forbidden by Scripture.
I mean, like, I know where I come from. Like, when they kill animals, they like take the blood. You can cook it. You can put like little seasoning in it.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Could you cook it? If you know of its health advantages or that it's healthy, there's no problem going with it. I'm just not an expert on health issues. I eat way too much sugar. I probably eat some things that I shouldn't. But as in Romans 14, Paul says, the kingdom of God does not mean eating and drinking. It means righteousness. So I don't worry about such things. So yes, if someone says, my culture has eaten blood, we cook it, we're careful with it, I recommend cooking meat. I recommend even cooking eggs. If you don't cook eggs, you don't cook your meat, you are risking health issues. So even though I'm not an expert in health and food, I would recommend cooking meat. So likewise, I'd say that reasonably so, but I've not done a deep dive into the health uses of blood. But raw blood, I'd put in the same category as eating raw meat. I know there's some people who do it.
Not raw. You can cook it.
Right.
People seasoning and you cook it, you know.
Yeah,
But
cook
you have to let it cook for a long time, you know.
Yeah.
It takes
Then
time.
I'm not worried. Again, just check out the health side of it. What do people that know about proper handling of food? What do they say? And that would be my advice. And I got to be careful. I don't give food advice. I'm giving biblical advice. But according to Scripture, there is no problem, spiritually anyway, with eating blood. But yeah, if you're going to eat it for a food value, cook it, and then be safe. Check with your doctor. I'll say that. Check with your doctor.
So there's nothing wrong with eating.
No.
You don't think there's anything wrong with eating blood?
No.
No. Okay. All right.
When I was in West Virginia, a lot of the witnesses said, well, can we eat roadkill? And they said, well, yes, if your car is the car that killed the deer, then you take your hunting knife out, leave the deer, and put it on top of the truck.
Sure. And it depends on how long it has been sitting out there for 3 days. That I'd say no.
No, but if your car is the means of death, then it would be a yes.
Yeah. Might want to check with the local police, but yeah, see what I got no other problems with that. Okay, anybody else? Any questions? *6, unmute yourself.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Hey.
I've actually put a question on the suite, but it's not really very clear the way I typed it out. But what it was about was Revelation 20. It's about the Millennium, and basically you've got these people that are resurrected in the first resurrection, and it said that they will the ones that have been faithful, who died for Christ, they will reign with Christ, and they will come to life and reign with Christ for 1,000 years, and the rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were ended.
Right.
So it says that Satan will be bound for 1,000 years.
Yes.
And unlike what the witnesses teach, he doesn't get loosed towards the end. He gets loosed after the end of the 1,000 years.
Yes.
So you've got this group of people that are resurrected, and if all these other people, the rest of the dead, don't come to life until after the 1,000 years were ended, who are they reigning over? Is this and also have they already been granted everlasting life? So the people that are resurrected who aren't of this resurrection, they won't be part of the millennium. They'll be resurrected afterwards, when Satan is loose. So is it this first resurrection? Is it all the righteous? Because otherwise, who do these people? If they're reigning with Christ, who are they reigning over? And
right.
Is it the unrighteous that are resurrected at the end of the 1,000 years to be tested again by Satan? I'm not quite sure, but it's not at all like, and he just says the same thing basically in the New World Translation.
Yeah, I understand your question. I'm going to rephrase it just in case everybody heard it clearly, and then I'm going to answer it.
Yeah.
I'm going to answer it.
Yeah.
So here's the issue. We've moved off of blood. We're now into talking about what I call the kingdom, the parousia kingdom. Most of us as witnesses don't understand parousia. It's the Greek word that means presence, the coming and presence of Christ. This is a term that scholars understand. So if you were to go up to someone with a PhD in biblical studies and you say, tell me about the parousia kingdom, they would understand your question, okay? So that's how the terminology I'm using. It's the parousia kingdom. And for the sake of argument, I'm going to say it's 1,000 years because of Revelation 20 calls it 1,000 years. I'm not going to argue about the length, exactly how many days, but we'll go with 1,000 years. Here's the question. Revelation 20 does mention, was it verses 4, 5, and 6, about something called the first resurrection, and they sit on thrones. It doesn't, of course, say where those thrones are, but just that there are thrones, and they are sitting on them. So I'm still rephrasing the question. So there's that event, the first resurrection, which is mentioned in verse 4, long verse. Verse 5, a little is where the question starts growing, because it says the rest of the dead did not come to life. All right, so we've got the first resurrection, all right, and those seem to all or apparently get thrones. But, well, there's a puzzle in there. Here's why. Because in verse 4, and I'm going to answer this, but I need to get all the questions out on the table here. In verse 4, it says, those who had been beheaded because of their testimony of Jesus. All right? So that kind of gets specific, and that's the first resurrection. Those seem to be Christians, but if we take it to the full description, these are not just Christians, these are certain Christians who were beheaded. And you know that's a subset of all Christians. I'm just throwing that out there to keep in mind that there's going to be some things that maybe we shouldn't take too literally, but let's go with it anyway that the first resurrection is mentioned. Okay? And then they came to life and reigned with the Christ for 1,000 years. That takes you up through the end of verse 4. Then verse 5 mentions the rest of the dead. Okay? Now, I'm glad that you asked this, and here's my answer. If you start studying this with Revelation, it will be confusing. In my church, I actually have a course. The course is about 30 hours long on the parousia kingdom, but we don't use Revelation to build the course. We look at all the verses outside of Revelation first. And using those verses, that fills in some gaps. And I'm claiming, here's my claim, which is part of my answer, that the answer to your question lies in other passages outside of Revelation. Revelation isn't giving the entire picture. It's giving some of the picture, some of new details that were never mentioned before, interesting details, but not all details. So my answer is going to draw on verses prior to the book of Revelation. Okay, so let's understand that. To get the full answer, I don't know how to use just the book of Revelation to get that answer. What we see in Revelation does paint the structure of it, which is some are raised to rule on thrones, but I don't think it's mentioning everybody that will be raised. Here's why I say that. I'm getting this from Matthew 24 and 25. Okay? I admit it, it's not all in Revelation, that not all the resurrections are listed, I claim, in Revelation. However, if you deal from Matthew chapter 24 and 25, you get a more complete picture. And as you build up more and more verses outside of Revelation, there's a bigger picture. And here's the picture I see, so I'm just going to cut to it. Based on the scriptures, and I'm just going to them off here. Matthew chapter 24, 25, and the parables there. Also from Luke 19, there's a parable there, and Luke 17. This gives you a picture, but you also fold into this hints and things from elsewhere, such as 1 Corinthians, end of chapter 5 and beginning of chapter 6. What is the picture? That, especially focusing on the sheep and the goats, which you're saying, okay, what does sheep and goats mean? I'm going to just get to it. When I have researched this, I have found like 25 explanations of some details of what the sheep and the goats is even talking about. I've had to land, I choose to land on one explanation. Now, what is that explanation? To summarize simply, I am a premillennial post-tribulationist. That's not the majority view. Premillennial is very popular, but it's still not everybody. It's not the unanimous view. So given that, those who hold to a premill post-trib view will answer this question basic I'm about to give you. Here's the answer. Jesus comes. One of the first things he does is he raises those who are in a covenant, had been in a covenant with Christ while alive. Covenant with God or covenant with Christ? After all, in the Old Testament, the one who appeared to Abraham was likely the Son of God, while the Father has remained invisible. So everyone that had a covenant with God is included in having a covenant with Christ. So everyone who's dead that has lived faithfully to a covenant is raised first. First resurrection. There's other resurrections, but that's the first. Then those who are living at the time that Christ comes, this is based on 1 Thessalonians 4, will be brought up. They're not dead, so that's not a true resurrection. They are gathered, they are rewarded, we see in Matthew 25, and given appointments of being reigning, ruling, judging, and mentoring others. But the question is, who are they mentoring? Well, right after this resurrection, there follows another resurrection. It is the resurrection of the sheep and the goats. This resurrection that's mentioned in Matthew 25, I don't find it in Revelation. Maybe in the next year I'll find it, but I don't see it yet in Revelation. It seems to be skipped over. Maybe it's in Revelation 7. I'm not convinced of that, but that's a maybe. But I see it in Matthew 25, beginning in verse 31 and following. And they are told, they are in there, the word righteous is used. The sheep are told they are righteous, even though they don't know who Jesus is. And what's funny is that the others that are raised and given positions of ruler are not said to be righteous. They are said to be faithful. There's a difference. Unfortunately, I don't have time to go into the differences. But faithful is beyond righteous. There's a passage in Romans that says someone won't die for someone. They won't even die for someone who's righteous. They might die for someone that's good, because good is more than being righteous. And that's a long. I'm not going to go into that. But there's a difference between good and righteous. There's a difference between faithful and righteous. Those who are faithful are the ones who rule. Those who are declared righteous, they are raised right following the first group. The first resurrection is those who will rule. Then there's a resurrection of the righteous. These ones don't really know Jesus. Have not been in any covenant with Jesus, but they are like the sheep described in Matthew 25, verse 30 and following. They are ushered into the new, there's a new heavens and a new earth. They are granted access to the new earth. Leviticus 19 mentions cities, 5 cities, 10 cities that are being ruled over. Well, who are in those cities? Again, I'm sorry, I don't remember what verse. I meant Luke 19. If I didn't say Luke 19, I'm sorry, I meant Luke 19. Mentions the cities, 5 cities, 10 cities, as a reward to those who are faithful. Who is granted entrance into the cities? Those who are righteous. So those who are faithful rule and judge over those who are righteous, and they're declared righteous because of the blood of the Lamb. That part is not found in Revelation 20. I wish it was, but I don't see it there. I only see it elsewhere in Matthew and Luke. And they rule over them for 1,000 years, or what Revelation 20 says is 1,000 years. These who sit on thrones have access to the new heaven, and they have access to the new earth. They will be ruling on earth. And they will have I believe, a resurrection, just like Jesus promised. And when Jesus said on the night of his death, I long to eat of the Passover with you, I will not eat of it until I eat of it with you fresh in the kingdom. Well, Jesus is going to come back. He's going to be physical, and he will dine and eat the Passover with his followers, who have been granted various responsibilities, some over 5 cities, some over 10 cities. But those who are in the cities are the sheep of Matthew 25, from verse 31 and following. They do this for, we'll say, the 1,000 years. At the end of the 1,000 years, then who are the rest of the dead? They are the goats. of the sheep and the goat story. They are raised. Now, they've already been judged, but they hadn't been raised. And they are judged at the beginning of the 1,000 years, or I think so. Some put it toward the end, whatever. But they are judged, and then they are raised at the end. After that 1,000-year, the parousia kingdom is done with. Because now, every person who has ever lived will stand and face the devil who is brought out of the abyss. I am a little bit uncertain as to who is it that some of the verses here in Revelation 20 of who it is that's deceived by the devil, but I suspect it's these guys. It's hard to know for sure. But whatever, there's the final test. Of course, those who were faithful in their covenant while in this life will still be faithful, of course. They cannot be affected by the temptations of the devil. That's ridiculous.
Because it says that the second death will have no power over them, so
that's right.
They've already been, yeah.
You're right. The second death has no power over them, so the thought that they could be deceived is nonsense. But somebody, according to Revelation 20, somebody is deceived, the nations. Somebody is deceived. I am open to the possibility that it might be some of the sheep, but I haven't, because there isn't a lot of confirming data on that, a lot of verses to confirm that. So I'm going to leave that open, and I'm not going to make a commitment. But somebody takes the side of the devil. Certainly those of the goats would be in there. And now everyone before the devil, who is the originator of all this mess in the Garden of Eden, and everyone that takes the side of the devil is vanquished and defeated. And Jesus turns to his Father and he says, Father, what you sent me to do, I've done. The devil, you gave him thousands of years to do this. You gave the demons thousands of years to do their best. And this is where it is brought. But I, your Son, have redeemed them. And these who are now here are washed white. And they no longer can die. They no longer have fear of death. They are eternal. They are immortal. And Father, here I hand them back to you. An absolutely clean universe. There is no defilement anywhere in the corner of the universe. Father, I've done it for you, for your glory. Here, it's yours. You may now come back to planet Earth. You were here in Eden, but because of sin, you left. I have come down in your stead. I have cleaned this mess up. You can now come down, and God will dwell with mankind. Well, that was an accelerated answer to the whole issue. That's the pre-mill, post-trib view, and I am still pondering some of these things I said I'm not certain of. So I am free to change my mind in the next 2 weeks. But that is where I hold to so far as to who will reign, who will they reign over, and if some Christians say that's nonsense, there won't be any such thing as reigning over others. You find it in Revelation 5. You find it in 2 Timothy 2, or is it 1 Timothy 2? I think it's 2 Timothy 2. And you find it, surprise, surprise, in 1 Corinthians 6, beginning of 6 and end of chapter 5, where Paul specifically says, in the kingdom, or in the life to come, some of you will judge others and settle ethical issues and disputes. That tells me that it is real. There will some who will be ruling over others, but they will all be there, alive and dealing with ethical issues. And it won't be just Jesus. It will be humans will be involved because Paul says so. It's vast.
Okay, Okay, thanks
a
very
lot of
much.
material. Yes.
I'll have a look at those other scriptures. Thanks.
Yes, and again, I offer a course. I'm finalizing it. It is a course. It's and I haven't even gotten into Revelation. It's about 30 hours long. It's 66 pages of 8.5 by 11. It's a course. It's partially done on video, but I just want to say that that's in the works. So in case someone says later on, hey, I'd like to see if I can get a copy of that, I will make it available. All right, Rick.
Jay, I'm here. Well, let me put myself up here. My goodness. Things are happening, Jay. Many people listening in today. In fact, it's really amazing to me. We have a lot more people listening in than 2 weeks ago. So that's a good thing, right?
That's a good thing, right? And I don't want to really apologize for going so long in the blood, but I wanted to cover everything. And it's kind of a one-time thing. If someone says, do it all again, no, I don't want to do it all again. But I can say, come back to the April 24th show and hear the full explanation of blood. And today we got this great question from that brother about what about the kingdom, the Parousia kingdom, and who's going to rule over. That was a fast summary of my entire 30-hour course, but I think it's good to hear it and know. But hey, there's other explanations, and I'm open. If someone says, hey, I got another explanation to 1 Corinthians 6, end of chapter 5 and beginning of chapter 6, I'd like to hear it. Or another explanation to the sheep and the goats of Matthew 25. I'd like to hear that.
Well, Jay, they're listening in more people than you've had in the last few weeks. So something's happening. More and more people are leaving the Watchtower. So that's a good thing, Jay. Great. Thank you for coming on. I mean, really, you're doing a great job.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, one more funny. I said, Rick, I got one disagreement. You said if we could sue the Watchtower, you'd be first in line. And I want to say, Rick, no, I want to be first in line.
There you go. Well, I think there's going to be a lot of lawsuits coming up. It's starting already.
Yeah.
Jay, you're a good guy. Don't you ever change. You just keep.
All right, brother.
You just keep staying Jay. Okay. Good.
All right. Catch you in 2 weeks.
Thank you. Appreciate it. See you then.
Bye-bye.